The night everything changed, I was being shoved toward a black car parked outside a half-lit motel on the edge of town. The gravel tore through my bare feet. The air smelled like exhaust and cold concrete. And then I heard the sound that broke me first, the soft, patient count of paper money somewhere behind me. Bills sorted. Coins dropped into a palm. My mother's voice low and businesslike. "Take her." I said, "She's worth it." I twisted around and screamed her name. She didn't look up. She stood 3 feet away in the yellow motel light, counting a stack of cash with the calm of someone finishing a simple errand. The man gripped my arm tighter. I bit hard into his hand, wrenched myself free, and ran barefoot into the road. Headlights flashed across me. I kept running until my legs gave out 6 blocks away on a dark sidewalk. My name is Jade Dawson. On that night, my own mother sold my safety for cash. And the man by that car had already recognized my face before I got away. I sat on a curb for a long time before I walked back. My feet left small dark prints on the pavement. When I reached our apartment building, I stood outside in the cold for several minutes before pushing the door open. Paula was in the kitchen, standing at the stove, stirring a pot of soup like it was any other Tuesday evening. The lamp above the counter made everything look warm and perfectly normal. She glanced over her shoulder when she heard me come in, looked at my torn clothes and bleeding feet, then turned back to the stove. "You're being dramatic," she said. I told her I had seen the money. Her spoon slowed for exactly 1 second, then continued its slow circles. "You misunderstood what was happening," she replied, her voice quiet and patient. "I was handling a situation. You panicked and ran." I stood in the doorway and stared at her back. Her shoulders never once tensed. Her voice never wavered. She wasn't even pretending to feel guilty. She had simply moved on and expected me to do the same. I waited until the apartment was quiet and Paula's bedroom light had been off for an hour. Then I moved down the hallway in the dark and slipped into her room. I wasn't sure what I was looking for. I just knew I needed to find something real. Something she couldn't explain away with a calm voice and a patient expression. I started with the closet shelf, running my hands along the back wall behind stacked boxes. My fingers found a thick envelope taped flat against the wall panel. I carried it to the window where the streetlight came through the curtain. Inside was a folded stack of cash and tucked behind it, a laminated copy of my school ID along with a photocopy of my state identification card. My hands went very still. My name. My face. Someone had paid Paula before. This wasn't the first time she had used my identity to complete a transaction. I stood in the dark holding that envelope and understood that the night at the motel had not been a single desperate mistake. It had been part of a pattern running much longer than I had realized. 2 days after the motel, my personal phone buzzed with a message from a blocked number. I almost didn't read it. I wish I hadn't. For words on the screen. "You weren't supposed to leave." I set the phone face down on my bed and pressed my hands flat against my knees to stop them from shaking. He had my number. The man from the parking lot, the one Paula had handed me to like a completed transaction, knew exactly how to reach me, which meant Paula had given him more than just my presence that night. She had given him my contact information as well. I deleted the message and sat completely still for a long time. I thought about the envelope in her closet. I thought about the copy of my ID. I thought about how she had called me dramatic while I stood in front of her with cut and bleeding feet. He knew where I lived. He had my number. And my mother had provided him with both. 3 nights after the blocked message, I was lying on my bed with the light off when I heard Paula's voice coming from the kitchen. She was on the phone, speaking just quietly enough that I almost couldn't make out the words. I pressed my ear against the bedroom wall and held my breath. Her voice was light and relaxed, the tone she used when things were going her way. "She's easy to manage," she said, and laughed softly at something the other person said. "She always comes back. That's just how she is." A pause while she listened. Then, "Give it a week. Things will settle." I pulled back from the wall and sat in the dark. My chest felt hollow. She wasn't worried about what had happened at the motel. She wasn't frightened that I had seen the money or come home shaking and bleeding. She was already managing the situation with her usual quiet confidence, the way she always managed things. She hadn't been surprised that I escaped. She had simply been waiting for me to calm down and return to where she needed me. Ray came for dinner on a Sunday afternoon 2 weeks after the motel. He was Paula's older brother. A broad, quiet man who usually talked about sports and complained about gas prices. He had always been around the edges of my life without ever feeling like a threat. But that Sunday I watched him more carefully than I ever had before. He didn't look at me once during the entire meal. Not once. He talked to Paula, ate his food, and kept his eyes carefully away from my side of the table throughout. After dinner, I passed the kitchen doorway and heard his voice drop low. "She's getting suspicious," he said. Paula's response was quick and quiet. I didn't catch all of it, but I heard enough. I walked back to my room slowly and sat on the edge of my bed. Ray wasn't an innocent bystander who had stumbled into the edges of this situation. He had always been inside it, close enough to know things, careful enough to stay invisible. He had simply been better at hiding it than I had ever thought to question. The following Monday I went to the school office to pick up a printed copy of my course schedule. The secretary looked up my name in the system, frowned, and typed something else. She asked me to wait and disappeared into the back office. 5 minutes later the vice principal came out with a careful expression and a folder in her hand. She told me that according to their records, I had been transferred to a different school across the district, effective 3 weeks ago. I told her that wasn't true. I had never applied for any transfer. I hadn't signed anything. She turned the folder toward me and showed me the transfer form. At the bottom was my name printed neatly, and a signature that was supposed to be mine. I looked at that signature for a long moment. The handwriting was close, but it wasn't mine. Paula had filed a transfer form using my identity, moving me on paper to a school I had never agreed to attend and had never once set foot inside. I went home that afternoon with a cold, steady knot in my stomach. 2 days later, a district official called our apartment and asked to speak with me directly. I answered before Paula could get to the phone. The official explained that a student registered under my name had never appeared at the receiving school, and that my enrollment at my current school had been flagged as inactive. In straightforward terms, I no longer officially existed in the school system anywhere. I had been removed from one school and had failed to appear at another. On paper I had simply vanished. I thanked her, ended the call, and went quietly to my room. I sat with my back against the closed door, and thought about what that actually meant. Someone was erasing me, not just removing me from a specific situation, but systematically deleting the institutional records that confirmed I existed as a real and located person. I wasn't just in danger inside this apartment. I was being made to disappear from the systems that could have helped anyone find me. The next morning I woke earlier than usual and sat on the edge of my bed with my phone in my hands. I had been thinking about it for 3 days and I had made a decision. I was done simply absorbing shocks and going quiet. Every time something had happened I had retreated and waited to understand it fully before moving. But waiting was no longer a safe strategy. I needed to start building something I could actually use. I opened my phone's voice recorder and set it to continuous record. I tucked the phone into the outer pocket of my school bag with the microphone facing outward through the fabric. Then I went to the kitchen for breakfast and sat across from Paula at the table. She talked about the weather and asked about my day. I answered normally and gave her nothing unusual to notice. But I was recording every word she said from that morning forward. She became more careful over the following days. Shorter sentences, vaguer language, fewer phone calls inside the apartment. But careful people still slip. I just needed to be patient enough to be there when she did. It happened on a Wednesday evening 11 days after I started recording. I had gone to bed early but was still awake when Paula came down the hallway, paused outside my door. I held my breath completely still, then moved toward the kitchen. I heard her unlock her phone. I already had my recording phone in my hand under the covers. I pressed record and lay perfectly flat. Her voice carried down the hallway, low and deliberate. "She'll be moved next week," she said. A pause. Then, "No mistakes this time." Another brief pause. "He already confirmed it. Same arrangement as before." I lay in the dark and kept the recording running until she hung up and her bedroom door clicked shut. Moved. Not transferred. Not sent somewhere safer. Moved. She had chosen that word deliberately, the same way you talked about furniture or boxes or anything that had no voice in where it ended up. I had been lying in that bed still wondering if she felt something for me underneath all of it. That recording ended any remaining question I had about that. The next morning I arrived at school 30 minutes early and went directly to Miss Ford's office. Miss Ford was the school guidance counselor. A steady, unhurried woman who kept plants on her windowsill and always seemed genuinely present when you spoke to her. I had talked to her only twice before briefly about course selections. I sat across from her desk and told her I needed help. I didn't use complicated language. I told her my mother had been accepting money from men in exchange for access to me, that someone had tried to put me in a car outside a motel, that I had a recording, and that I had found documents with my copied identity in them. Miss Ford sat completely still while I spoke. When I finished, she asked 3 careful questions and told me she was going to make some calls and for me to come back the following morning. I left her office feeling something I hadn't felt in weeks, the fragile, thin sensation of not being entirely alone in this. But when I arrived the next day, her office was dark. Her desk had been cleared. A substitute was covering her classes. Miss Ford was simply gone. I stood outside Miss Ford's empty office for a long moment, then walked back to my locker with a controlled calm I didn't actually feel. Someone had warned Paula. Whether Miss Ford had called our apartment, or a school notification had been sent, or someone inside the building had passed information along, I didn't know the exact route. What I knew was that the one adult I had trusted with the truth had disappeared within 24 hours of hearing it. I went home that afternoon to find the lock on my bedroom door had been changed. I tested the handle. It opened normally from the inside. But the outside had been fitted with a keyed lock only Paula could operate from the hallway. She was standing nearby watching me try it. "Safety reasons," she said, her voice pleasant and unhurried. "The building manager suggested it." I looked at her and nodded slowly. We both understood clearly that the building manager had suggested nothing at all. My room was no longer simply my space. It had become the place she could seal me inside whenever the situation required it. 4 days later, a man arrived at our apartment on a Saturday morning. He drove a clean silver car and wore a pressed button-down shirt. He looked like someone who attended neighborhood meetings and coached youth sports. He smiled at me when Paula introduced us in the living room doorway. A wide, patient smile that didn't match the way his eyes moved. His eyes traveled over me slowly and deliberately, the way a person looks at something they are assessing for a particular purpose. "This is Mr. Vance," Paula said, her voice warm and social. "A business partner." Mr. Vance extended his hand. I shook it because not shaking it felt more dangerous than shaking it in that moment. His grip was brief and dry. He and Paula moved to the kitchen table and talked quietly for nearly an hour while I sat in my room with my recording phone running. I couldn't make out everything clearly, but I heard my name spoken 3 times and what sounded like a dollar amount mentioned twice. When he left, Paula hummed quietly to herself while she washed their cups. I had watched Paula use her banking app dozens of times over the years without thinking much about it. She kept her phone unlocked on the coffee table while she watched television, which was how I had seen her password entered enough times to memorize it. 2 evenings after Mr. Vance's visit, she fell asleep on the couch with her phone beside her. I picked it up carefully and opened the banking app. 3 accounts. I scrolled through the last 4 months of transaction history slowly. The payment labels stopped me completely. Descriptions entered manually by the sender. Arrangement. Delivery. Confirmation fee. Completion. I photographed every screen before the display dimmed, then placed the phone back exactly where it had been. In my room with my back against the door, I studied what those words meant lined up in a column with dates and amounts beside them. The payments were regular, consistent, and they stretched further back than the 4 months I could access. I had not been the first. Whatever Paula had been running quietly from our apartment, she had been running it for a long time before I was old enough to understand what was happening around me. Becca sat beside me in second period English and had never been more than a friendly face I occasionally borrowed a pen from. She wasn't part of my circle, mostly because I had stopped letting anyone get close enough to ask real questions. But Becca noticed things quietly and kept them to herself, which I had always respected even before I understood how much it would come to matter. One morning she slid into the seat beside mine and placed a small prepaid phone on the edge of my desk, covered under her notebook. "I've noticed how you look when you come in some mornings," she said softly, eyes fixed forward like we were simply discussing the assignment. "You don't have to tell me anything. But if something happens and you need someone to know, call the number already saved in it. She moved the notebook back and the phone disappeared into my bag before I fully processed what had happened. I held what she had said quietly inside me for the rest of the day. That small prepaid phone was the first thing in months that felt like an actual door rather than another wall closing around me. Over the next 5 days I moved carefully and without any outward change to my routine. I woke at the same time, ate breakfast at the same table, came and went from school on the same schedule. Paula was watchful but not alarmed. She had no reason yet to believe I was doing anything other than settling back into place the way she had always predicted I would. But in the space between those ordinary moments, I was building quietly and without stopping. Every banking screenshot was saved to the burner phone Becca had given me. Every recording was backed up to a cloud account I had created from a school library computer, using an email address Paula didn't know existed. The photographs of the envelope, the cash, the copied ID were stored and organized with dates. I had a detailed written record of Mr. Vance's visit and everything I had captured of that conversation. Leaving too soon would alert her and give her time to react and disappear. I needed one more strong piece, something that clearly connected the financial transactions to a specific named arrangement, before I could move safely and completely. It was a Friday afternoon and I had stayed late at school for a makeup quiz. When I got back, the front door was unlocked and the apartment was quiet in a way that felt occupied rather than empty. I moved down the hallway toward my room and stopped. Paula was already inside it. I heard the careful slide of a drawer being opened and closed, the shuffle of papers, the deliberate sound of someone searching methodically. I had taken everything important out of that room weeks ago. The burner phone lived in my school locker. All documents were stored in the cloud. There was nothing left in that room for her to find. But I couldn't walk in without revealing I had heard her. I stepped back to the front door, opened and closed it loudly as if I had just arrived. By the time I reached my bedroom doorway, she was sitting calmly on the edge of my bed, picking at a thread on the bedspread. "Just straightening up," she said pleasantly. I smiled and said thank you and set my bag on the chair. She had stopped inches from the spot where I used to keep things. She was still looking, which meant she was still worried. 2 days before I planned to act, Paula sat me down at the kitchen table on a quiet Sunday morning with 2 cups of tea and a calm, reasonable expression. She spoke slowly and clearly, like she was explaining something entirely practical. She said the family was in a difficult financial period, and that there were ways I could help ease things if I was willing to cooperate with certain arrangements she had already put in place. She used the phrase "help the family" 3 separate times. She never named a specific amount or described what cooperation would actually require. She didn't need to. I understood exactly what arrangements had always meant inside our apartment. I sat across from her with both hands around my cup and listened without reacting. I told her I would think about it. She nodded and smiled and refilled my cup. I looked at her steady hands and her unhurried expression and understood something I had been quietly resisting for a long time. She wasn't desperate or broken or confused. She had never been any of those things. She was organized. She had a functioning system. And I had been a working part of it since long before I was old enough to recognize what I was looking at. That same Sunday evening, I walked to the school library before closing and sat at a back computer terminal with the burner phone beside me. I had spent 3 days composing the message in my head, what to include, what order to present it in, how to make it clear and credible without sounding frightened. I found an investigative contact through a nonprofit that specialized in exploitation cases, an anonymous submission portal that accepted documents and recordings without requiring personal identification. I uploaded everything. The banking screenshots with the labeled transactions. The recording of Paula saying I would be moved next week with no mistakes this time. The photographs of the envelope containing my copied ID and the cash. The dated record of Mr. Vance's visit and the conversation fragments I had captured. A written account of the school transfer filed in my name without my knowledge. I submitted it all and sat for a quiet moment after the confirmation screen appeared. I had just set something in motion that could not be undone or recalled. I closed the browser, cleared the history, and walked out of the library into the evening air. My hands were completely steady. For the first 3 days after the submission, nothing visibly changed. I went to school, came home, ate dinner, went to my room. Paula maintained her usual calm routine. Then on the 4th day, I noticed a dark blue sedan parked on the opposite side of our street. It was there when I left for school and still in the same position when I returned. The following day a different car, gray and unremarkable, had taken a nearby spot. I didn't react outwardly, but I noted every detail carefully. On the fifth day I came home to find Paula standing at the living room window, watching the street below with her arms tightly folded. She didn't hear me come in. I watched her from the hallway for nearly a minute. Her posture was tense and alert in a way I had never once seen before. The woman who had always moved through her life with complete and practiced confidence was standing at that window with something new written across her shoulders, something tight and watchful that I recognized immediately, because I had been feeling it myself for months. She was afraid, and she had no idea yet how much further this was going to go. Over the following 2 days, Paula moved through the apartment with a tight, stripped-down urgency I had never seen in her before. She made long phone calls from the bathroom with the water running. She opened the hall closet repeatedly. On the second evening, I passed the kitchen doorway and saw her at the table with a small stack of envelopes, a passport, and her laptop open to a travel booking page. She was preparing to leave, but she hadn't moved fast enough. Somewhere in the process I had set in motion by submitting everything to the reporting portal, her accounts had already been flagged. When she tried to move the larger sums, the transactions didn't go through. I heard her on the phone late that night, her voice stripped of its usual composure, demanding to know why she couldn't access her own funds. I lay in my bed in the dark and listened to her voice rise and then collapse into a tense and clipped silence. The woman who had always controlled everything around her was discovering what it felt like to reach for something she had always counted on, and find it completely blocked. The knock came on a Thursday morning at 7:45. I was in my room with my school bag packed and ready at my feet. I had slept in my clothes. 3 sharp, deliberate knocks at the front door. Paula crossed the living room in quick steps. I stood at the edge of my bedroom doorway and watched from the hallway. When she pulled the front door open, 2 officers in plain clothes were standing outside. One held up identification. The other carried a folder. The first officer said they were from the Financial Crimes Unit and were there regarding an ongoing investigation into financial exploitation and trafficking activity connected to this address. Paula stood completely still in the doorway. I watched her face move through 3 different expressions in under 2 seconds, surprise, then rapid calculation. Then the controlled blankness she assembled like a practiced piece of armor. Then she turned. Slowly, as if the movement required considerable effort, she looked directly across the room at me. For the first time in my entire life, my mother looked at me with something other than management or indifference written in her eyes. She was afraid. And for the first time I was not. They asked her to come with them. She asked for a moment to get her coat. One officer stepped inside the doorway. Paula moved to the coat rack slowly, her back straight, and I watched her try to gather some version of her usual composure around herself. She put on her coat. She picked up her bag. And then she turned to me one final time and said, in a voice so tightly controlled it was almost unrecognizable, "You don't know what you've done." I didn't answer. I didn't move. I stood at the edge of the hallway and watched the officers walk her out through the front door of our apartment. I heard her voice briefly in the corridor, sharp and insistent, and then the elevator doors opened and closed and the building went completely quiet. I stood in the middle of the living room for a long time without moving. The apartment felt different with her gone. Larger. Stiller. Like a room you hadn't known was too small and too airless until the moment you were finally standing alone inside it, and could breathe all the way in for the first time. The trial began 4 months later. I had been placed with a temporary guardian, a woman named Ellen who ran a clean, quiet house 40 minutes outside the city. I testified on the 3rd day. The courtroom was smaller than I had expected. I sat in the witness chair and spoke slowly and clearly and kept my eyes on the jury rather than on Paula's table. I described the night at the motel. I described finding my copied ID in the closet envelope. I described the banking transactions labeled arrangement and delivery and completion. The recordings were played in full, including the phone call where Paula said I would be moved next week and that there would be no mistakes this time. Financial investigators presented the banking records and traced the payment history back 31 months. A second witness testified, a woman I had never met, who described an experience with Paula that had preceded mine by nearly 2 years. I did not look at my mother during any of it. She sat at her table with her eyes fixed on the surface in front of her and said nothing. The woman who had always had a smooth and patient answer for everything had finally run completely out of words. 7 months after the trial, I was living in a 2-room apartment in a city I had chosen entirely for myself. I had a part-time job, a community college enrollment form on my kitchen table, and a small plant on the windowsill that I watered every Sunday without fail. The apartment was mine, chosen by me, paid for by me, filled only with things I had selected. No one else had a key. One afternoon a letter arrived in the mailbox with Paula's name printed in the return address corner. I recognized her handwriting immediately, neat and deliberate, exactly as it had always been. I carried it inside and set it on the table. I made tea and sat down and held the envelope for a moment, feeling its weight. There was no apology inside. I already knew that without opening it. What was inside would be a carefully arranged attempt to reframe the past and reclaim some small portion of control from a distance. I set it down, folded it once, and placed it in the recycling bin. Then I watered my plant and stood at the window and watched the street below for a quiet moment. Some betrayals don't deserve closure. They deserve distance. And I had finally given myself enough of both to last the rest of my life.